Hello. So earlier, Katerina and I did LinkedIn Live, and we had a fantastic, robust conversation for half an hour. But frustratingly, for some reason, the sound quality at the audience's end was abominable, and no one could hear what we were saying. And so Katerina asked if I would try and distill down some of the messages that we got across, or we tried to get across in the call. And so I'm going to try and do that as quickly as I possibly can. Um, One of the things that we spoke about very quickly was, where do we get stories from? And I talked about the fact that storytelling is used in lots of different ways. So if you go on LinkedIn and you put in storytelling, there's stacks and stacks of stuff about storytelling, and often it's corporate narrative, it's brand identity. We often talk about storytelling as coaches. We say, "What is the story you are telling?" and so on. In this case, the storytelling I am talking about is actually telling stories with an idea to motivate, inspire. As leaders, we use storytelling, and it's a terrific tool when we can access it. And so, with that in mind, using the stories from our own lives and how we can how bring those and access those and bring those to an audience. And so she asked how I would go about doing that, and I said I have an ABC method that I use, and I went through it. A stands for audience. So working out what is in it for the audience. What are they getting from this? If all you are doing is telling them a nice story, well, great, but all you've done is waste their time for however long the story took to tell. So it's essential that there is a point to whatever story you're telling, and that you put yourselves in the audience's shoes. I talked about what frame are the audience viewing this from, and what frame are you telling it from. B point two, is for blueprint or bullet points. And here I talk about usually try and distill the story down to 5 bullet points. If you were doing the Twitter version of the story, you're having to write out single sentences that show what the absolute essential elements of the story. What are those essential elements? Once you have the bullet point version, then you can start to flesh them out. You can start to turn those sentences into paragraphs. You can start to wordsmith it. C is for connection, human connection. And I told the story of this experiment that was done in the States, where they fed 10,000 bestseller stories into an AI and asked it, what is the common success theme? What makes a bestseller a bestseller? And of course, they thought it was going to be something to do with the writing or the language used or the stories themselves. But actually, it was about human connection. That's what the AI came back with. That's what makes a best-selling story, that we end up, as a listener, as a reader, we have an empathic connection with the people in the story. So make sure that your stories have a connection element. And Katerina asked, how do you go about doing that? And I talked about emotive language, loading your stories with emotive language, specifically metaphor. And the fact that metaphor is incredibly useful because it accesses different parts of the brain at the same time. When we hear a metaphor, so for example, if the one I gave was, if we talk about shouldering a burden, actually when we hear that, a part of our brain that is involved with lifting, it fires up. We don't physically lift anything, but that part of our brain is triggered, and so it has an effect on what we hear, and it has a deepening effect on the experience. So that's the ABC. But after that, there's also D and E. And D stands for detail and destination. So detail within reason. And I often give the story, and I gave the story earlier, of people they'll start a story, and it goes something like this. I think it was a Wednesday. Oh, no, hang on. No, hang on. It must have been can't have been a Tuesday. No, it was Thursday. It was Thursday because I was taking my son to football practice. Nobody cares, okay? And none of that detail was relevant. We don't care what day of the week it was, unless it is relevant. If, for example, your story takes place on a significant date. So, for example, I used 9/11. If you are telling a story about how you came home at lunch and you saw the second tower fall and that's had a profound effect on you, then the date matters. The day matters. Otherwise, it's superfluous detail, which you don't need. So, think about what detail is essential and what detail you can jettison. Destination, know where you're headed, know where the end is. So, we learned back in primary school, every story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they don't necessarily have to go in that order, but they do have to be there. Make sure it has an end. And stop there. And E is for education, which I pointed out sounds heavy-handed and didactic, but it's just because it fits the ABCDE. And so the education I'm talking about is make sure that you know what you learned from the experience and what you want the audience to learn from hearing about the experience. And that sort of completes the ABCDE. And then Katerina asked me if I had any thoughts on how to be a better presenter. And I gave my 3 top tips for better presenting. Number 1 is enthusiasm, passion. Be enthusiastic, be passionate, and smile within reason. If it's a funeral, you might not want to smile, unless you're telling a happy story about the person. If you're coming out and you're talking to your workforce and you've got to tell 200 of them that they are being laid off, it's probably not best to smile. But if this is something where you can smile, please do, because it tells the audience that this isn't going to hurt. This isn't going to be torture. So smile. Tip number 2 is clarity of message, of voice, of gesture. So clarity of message, I've kind of already covered in the ABCDEs. That's the reason we do the bullet pointing and the destination. That's the reason we work these things out. We work out the connection. We want to know what the message is. What is the story I'm telling? So with message out the way, clarity of voice, Katerina asked, how can you be a better speaker? And I talked about breathing down into the body and letting the breath carry the voice rather than straining from up here, which we often do, which leads to hoarseness. The third thing, clarity of gesture, things like this, mapping things out in space, giving yourself that kind of gestural language as well, a bit of body language. I talked about radiating. If you show something, show it and let it be shown, for want of a better term. Let it be, and then you can let it go. Don't rush through things because they'll be missed and the audience will be thinking, what just happened? And the final top tip, number 3, is rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Work out what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and then practice, and practice, and practice, and practice. Because that's what really good speakers do. They don't just riff. They don't just try and do it off the top of their head, which is what I'm doing right now. They practice. So if you put all those things together, we've got the ABCDE, audience, bullet points, connection, detail and destination, education, and you've got the top tips, which are enthusiasm, clarity, and rehearsal. And that was largely what we covered. I think I've managed to fit it all in just under 10 minutes. Not bad. I hope you've managed to get this far. If you have, thank you for listening, and thank you for trying to listen earlier. Have a cracking weekend. Cheers. Bye-bye.